Alright, so today's video we're going to be going through an entire presentation on small-sided games and why they are scientifically our most effective way to improve and see in-game results. So it could be 30, 45 minutes, whatever it is, but again, I'm going to take you guys through some evidence, break down what small-sided games are, give you guys kind of the whole entire spiel, and then the next video we're going to be posting is 5 of my favorite small-sided games, which will be coming out later this week, so stay tuned for that. So with that said, let's get into what an actual small-sided game is. If you guys are not familiar, I know a lot of you guys already know what it is, but if you guys are not familiar, a small-sided game is essentially just an adjusted form of play, modifying the amount of players, space, scoring, etc. Now, small-sided games are essentially just a smaller version of the larger game, right? So we can take a situation of a game, break it down with less players, less space, and we're kind of mimicking the exact same thing you'd see in a game, just with less players. We're able to, through small-sided games, get higher amount of volume in certain situations, certain reps, certain skills, and things like that. And in my opinion, small-sided games are absolutely still skill work. This is kind of an argument some people have is like, oh, we can do our small-sided games, but then we still got to get our reps, right? We still got to get our skill work. And I would argue that small-sided games is actually our highest value skill work that we can possibly get. Now, the reason why we're going to use small-sided games is because we're not going to get enough reps for certain situations with 5-on-5. And a lot of times you'll see players who maybe they just go into the corner, they're a catch-and-shoot guy. If we're in 5-on-5, you can easily get away with not really touching the ball, not really working on anything that's your weakness. So when we do small-sided games, whether it's 2-on-2, 3-on-3, that guy who maybe is just off the dribble or he's just off the catch, kind of has to do everything, right? So we have to kind of work on things that we're not comfortable with, get into certain situations that we're not necessarily good at. And the other thing with, say, 5-on-5, say you really want to work on your ball handling. If we're in 5-on-5, maybe you're not the guy who's dribbling the ball a lot. So the second you put the ball on the floor, coach is yelling at you to pass the ball. We can't really work on that. Same thing if you're a point guard, you don't get enough reps shooting off the catch. Again, you're not really going to get enough reps in those situations. So we're going to use small-sided games to kind of lean more towards getting our reps, but still doing so in a very game-specific environment. So that's just kind of the basic spiel of what a small-sided game is and kind of why we would use it as opposed to just 5-on-5 or just our skill work getting reps. It's kind of somewhere in between, and I think that's where we're going to get the most value for doing skill work and developing and getting the in-game results that we want. Now, this is kind of just an example of a small-sided game. This is a very basic one. This is a 3-on-3 small-sided game. Now, what I'm manipulating in this situation is the size of the court. So I could do a 3-on-3 where they get the entire court, but again, I want to manipulate the space to make it a little more realistic. So I cut off the court essentially at the opposite lane line, so it's cut off in this view right here. And I also only allowed one dribble. The other rule was we're only going jump shots, so there was no floaters, there was no layups. Now with this small-sided game, what are we working on? We're working on our ability to catch and shoot, to make reads, to attack the defense, to cut, to move without the ball, right? A lot of different things going on in one small-sided game. So I'll let you guys just take a quick look. All right, so very basic example, but as you guys can see, every single person touched the ball. Every single person had to move without the ball, right? So a lot of different things going on. Very valuable, especially if we're getting a lot of reps at that. You're going to get much more reps in that situation working on the 3-on-3 in a small-sided game like that, as opposed to, say, in a 5-on-5. A lot of different ways we can manipulate the time, the score, the spacing. We'll get into all that kind of stuff. But again, that's just a very basic example of what a small-sided game is, just a smaller version of the real game. Now, the first thing I want to get into is why do coaches avoid them in the first place, right? A lot of coaches, we're either doing 5-on-5 or we're doing on-air reps. Now, why do we not do small-sided games? Oftentimes, the number one reason why in the beginning of my career of a trainer is I would do them and then I'd kind of get away from them, right? Especially as an independent trainer or someone who maybe you're running at camp or something like that, right? And you have a lot of parents watching. Small-sided games can be a lot more ugly than your typical on-air reps, right? You're not going to mess up as much. It looks a lot more organized. Kids seem to be doing a lot better. You know, they're scoring more points, all that kind of stuff. So if you have parents watching you, those parents don't want to see their kid messing up. They kind of want to see their kid making a lot of layups, looking really good, right? That's kind of what the parents want at initially, not that the parents always know exactly what's best for them, but it looks better, right? It seems like they're making more progress. So naturally, you're going to kind of avoid that if you're trying to, say, please the parents to get them to keep coming back to you as a trainer. But as we'll get into, training ugly is a very important part to getting better. And it's not something that we can really avoid if we're aiming for the best possible results. But this is a very common way of why people try to avoid them. Again, they're ugly. There's a lot more mistakes, and they seem more unorganized from the outside, especially if you have less advanced players. But it's still crucial no matter what age you guys are working with. The other most common one is you're not going to see those results as fast. Now, there's a reason why I put them in parentheses, because we're not talking about actual in-game results, we're talking about practice results, right? So if we do say we're working on a certain footwork off the catch, right, or tacking downhill, a certain finish, if we work on that on air, we can see results by the end of that practice. We can see that a player improved, but again, all we really did was get better at practice. We didn't get better in the actual game, so it's not a real result. But we can see these results a lot faster in a much more controlled, dumbed down setting, right, that on-air rep. So it feels like we're having this player make progress. This is false progress because it doesn't actually translate, but it looks like we're getting these results faster. So that's oftentimes where coaches, why would I work on a small-sided game where I'm not going to see the results as fast? They're not going to get better in that session when I can just work on air and I can see them actually get better in front of my eyes. Now, that's oftentimes misleading, but again, this is oftentimes why coaches avoid those small-sided games. They're uglier. We don't see those results as fast. Now, the other one is just, it's not always what's been done, right? It's not common, especially in the States, really anywhere where you see most coaches doing small-sided games, right? Most AAU programs, you go in there, we see stationary ball handling for 25 minutes, we see some pickup, or we see them just working on some basic-ass layups with no defense. So it's not necessarily what's been done. If you don't know what to do, you're typically going to fall back to what your coach did with you or what your parent did with you, right? So we're not going to, oh, I don't know what to do. Let me just experiment with some small-sided games and hope this works, right? So it's not what's always been done. That's partially what I'm trying to change with this video, just with the obviously content that I put out, is trying to change that norm a little bit and make it a little bit more commonplace, especially here in the States. So those are kind of a couple reasons why coaches don't do them in the first place. So maybe you guys fall into one of those categories. Just understand it as we go through this rest of this presentation. Now, getting into what actually makes them so beneficial. I want to start off with a quote from the book, How We Learn to Move by Rob Gray. Absolutely good quote that kind of just prefaces everything that we're going to get into. And this quote says, an effective coach should attempt to design practice environments that foster exploration and promote self-organization rather than prescribing a solution to an athlete. In doing this, they need to take into account what they are working with and adding to, rather than ignoring their previous experience and forcing athletes to do it my way. Coaches need to accept in a complex system they cannot possibly know the optimal movement solution for an athlete. They can only help them find it for themselves. So yes, this may seem complex. If you guys don't necessarily know too much about small-sided games or skill acquisition science, this seems very confusing. Don't worry, we will get into it. But I would screenshot this or I would write this down if you guys are taking notes, because this will make a lot more sense as we go through this presentation. But in my point of view, in my scientific research so far, this is the conclusion that I've came to. That is what an effective coach should be doing, especially in training and in player development in general, whether you're a coach or whether you are a trainer. Again, this will make more sense as we go. So one of the main benefits of small-sided games is what we call implicit learning. Implicit learning is learning without consciously being aware of what we are learning. So think of you growing up as a kid, right? You have your parent telling you something over and over and over again. Oftentimes it doesn't stick, right? Oh, I don't really care what they're saying. It just naturally doesn't stick as much. But when you go and do something on your own, say you learn a lesson the hard way, right? Parent tells you not touch the stove, not touch the stove, not touch the stove. You touch the stove, you realize it's hot. You kind of learn that on your own. It's going to stick a little bit better. Very broad example, but you guys kind of get the point, right? And when we're doing small-sided games, oftentimes what we're not doing is, like that paragraph we just saw before, is giving them the solutions, telling them exactly what to do. We're allowing them to kind of figure it out on their own. This is oftentimes where you see the best athletes in the world. They got so much better oftentimes by just playing a shit ton of pickup. They learned implicitly. No one told them the technique of shooting a layup. No one told the technique of specific footwork getting into the shot. They just kind of figured it out through trial and error over time by just playing a lot of pickup, right? So we can kind of mimic this by getting into small-sided games, 3-on-3, creating problems and allowing those players to solve those problems on their own. Now, the other thing that we were also kind of just saw in that paragraph is implicit learning allows us to fit solutions on top of the current athlete based on those athletes' individual constraints. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So say we're working on a one-on-one or a one-on-0 situation, right? We're giving every single athlete the same exact solution. So say we were training Russell Westbrook, Kyrie Irving, Luka Doncic, and Trae Young. We're not going to give every single athlete, each one of those, the same exact move to do in the same exact scenario. One's a little faster, one's taller, one can jump higher. They're going to use different solutions in different situations. So by allowing them to figure these things out implicitly on their own, they're going to lean more towards solutions that benefit them as an individual, right? So Russell Westbrook's learning how to finish over maybe a smaller defender. They're just going to go up and dunk it. Same thing with Kyrie Irving. He might use a little more spin on the ball just because he's a little more creative. Luka Doncic might finish a little bit slower because that's what works for him. So again, there's no one-size-fits-all for everyone in every single situation. So by using small-sided games, these players are able to learn what works for them based on their individual constraints. Now, individual constraints might be how long their arms are, how high they can jump, their movement limitations, their certain skills, right? So there's a wide range of situations that they're going to lean into doing certain things over the other just because of how they're built, how fast they are, all that kind of stuff. Now, the other thing is, and the really important thing, is implicit learning is more stable under pressure and sees much higher transfer to the actual game. So the more explicit that we learn something, meaning the more that we as a coach teach an athlete something, the more likely that athlete is to revert back to that under pressure. So to give you guys a quick example, say I'm teaching a player how to shoot. If everything that I tell them is very explicit, move your elbow here, flick your wrist like that, follow through here. When they're under pressure, say they're at their free throw line, they're going to think back to every single little cue that I gave them and how they learned it. So the biggest thing in terms of being under pressure and performing is not thinking internally. We don't want to consciously control our movement with whatever we're doing, right? It could be a step back three at the end of the game. It could be a free throw. It could be a layup. Just the more conscious we learn these things, the less they're going to hold up under pressure. So if we want players that are effective in late game situations under pressure, right? They're going into a playoff game, they need to perform. The players who learned implicitly without being taught every single little detail are always going to perform better, right? So this is a big thing where you think back to typical training, right? It's 1-on-0. We have a coach teaching the players exactly what to do, exactly how to move, where to put their foot, how to bend their knees, how to bend their hips, right? It's way too explicit. It's way too detailed, right? We can teach players details without actually teaching them the details. That's a whole nother point. But again, we don't want to give these players every single little point because when the pressure is on, they're going to revert back to that. And that is exactly what's not going to hold up under pressure. So players who learn things implicitly, learn them on their own, they have no reference for what to think back from. If they just learned how to shoot by just shooting, they can't think about, okay, where's my elbow, where's my wrist, because they didn't learn it that way. So that's just a quick little point, and one thing that makes small-sided games so beneficial. Implicit learning, it's more stable under pressure, but we're also just going to see much higher transfer to the actual game based on what we're working on. Now, getting into our next point is all about variability. Now, there's two specific realms of variability in terms of small-sided games. Number one, practice reps, but also movement solutions. So these are two very different things. The biggest thing is true movement skill. Like you see the best shooters, the best movers, whatever it is, right? It comes down to the ability to solve the same problem by using a lot of different ways to solve that problem. So this is what we call repetition without repetition. Now think back to, say, math class, right? In 7th grade, 8th grade, whatever. You have the teacher who's like, okay, you got to solve this problem. How do we get to 4? It's like, okay, we can do 2 + 2 = 4, or we can also do 1 + 3 = 4, or we can also do 4 + 0 = 4. But then you have the teacher who's telling you, no, we can only do 2 + 2 = 4, right? There's a lot of different ways we can get to that solution, but we have the coach who's telling us, okay, no, you have to do it this way, right? That's oftentimes what we see in typical training, right? It's like, no, that's not how we're supposed to do it. You're supposed to do it this way. But again, every athlete's different, so every athlete's going to get to that solution a little bit different. Now, the other thing is that there's no one way to do anything, but there's no true same situation in any game. You can be shooting from the same spot in the same exact situation, but that situation is never the exact same, right? Maybe one day you're a little more tired than the next. You're a little more fatigued. You're leaning a little more to the right, leaning more to the left. So even though we're in the same exact situation, we're going to solve that problem a little bit different. Now, if we're only practicing solving a problem in one specific manner, we don't have true variability, right? True variability is being able to solve the same problem with slightly different ways of solving it. Kind of complex, but again, that's just something to keep in mind when we're doing small-sided games. Now, small-sided games inherently have variability. We can be doing the same exact situation, right? Say we're working on a catch, we have to read the defense, we have to get to the rim. We can do the same finish, but it's going to be somewhat different every single time just because we have defense. We're going to attack from a slightly different angle, slightly different speed. We're going to jump a little bit higher, jump a little bit lower, right? So no matter what we're doing in small-sided games, even though we're doing the same exact thing, trying to solve the same exact problem, we're going to do it in different ways, which is going to teach this athlete to solve problems in a different manner. Now, the other thing that we see with variability is its much higher rate of transfer. Now, again, getting back to kind of our original point, is we're not going to see results as fast, but we're going to see results more effectively in games. So if we look at variability versus block practice, just to give you guys kind of reference, is doing the same exact thing over and over again with zero interrupting skill, right? So we're shooting catch and shoot shots. We're going to shoot them the same footwork, same spot, same speed every single time. Variability is we're just kind of interrupting that skill by doing it just a little bit different every single time. Now, when we look at block versus variable studies show that we're not going to see that initial improvement as quick, but when we transfer it over into games and we see what's more effective, variability is 10 times more effective, not literally, but way more effective every single time. We're going to see those in-game results way more effectively than if we do block. So again, why would we do block? We're going to get that fake improvement. We're going to see that initial improvement in practice, but we're not going to see it in games. So if we're looking for what's actually going to get players results in games, it's going to be variability. Variability is natural in small-sided games. We're not only going to get that with the type of reps, but also the movement solutions that we do, which is going to make a player much more effective. Again, like we said, true movement skill comes down to the ability to have multiple solutions to the same exact problem. Again, keep that in mind. Now, third point, and one of our most important ones, is what we call specificity. Now, specificity is just how specific our practice environment is to our game environment. So this is the entire spectrum, right? If we want to make it as specific as possible, that's an actual game. 5-on-5 with a crowd, with a time, with a score. On the other end of the spectrum, 1-on-0, 0 crowd, 0 pressure, 0 time, 0 score. Now, small-sided games is going to move us closer to the end of that spectrum and be more specific. Now, the biggest thing to specificity is the closer we are to the actual thing, the more effective our practice will be at transferring over to the game. Now, it's not possible that we can always be doing 5-on-5, and that's not always going to be the most beneficial. But again, we don't always want to be at the total end of the spectrum either, because there's going to be extremely low transfer. So small-sided games is a way for us to almost meet in the middle, get reps in certain things, focus on certain skills, but also contain those same game elements we're going to see in an actual game, because that's what's going to help us actually transfer over into a game. So some of those game qualities would be, right, real defense, spacing, some sort of pressure because you're actually having to play against somebody, right? You're going to be a lot more nervous in that situation than when you're by yourself, right? There's no pressure whatsoever. There's 0 game elements. Even if you work on a certain thing a million times, it's just not going to transfer over that well. And the other thing, which is one of the biggest things, is what we call perception-action coupling, right? So there's never a time in a game where you don't have to read the defense. You could be working on a catch-and-shoot shot. It doesn't matter. You're always reading the defense to some degree. So what we see in typical training is we kind of separate these two, right? We have perception, which is reading, and we have the action, which is the actual doing. All we really do is practice the doing. We practice the catch and shoot. We practice the footwork, but we don't practice the actual perception, the read that goes with that skill. So every time we use a skill in a game, we have to read, and then we have to do based on what we're reading. So this is where we see all this types of skills training breakdown, is because the player has the action. They know how to do it. They know exactly the technique, but they just don't know when to do it. So we can master that skill, but if we can't use it in the game because we never learned the read, it's just not going to work, right? So the best way that we can do this and see this skill actually translate is by combining the two together to some degree. And this is what we can do in small-sided games, right? Say we're working on reads, or we're working on a certain footwork off the catch, getting into a shot. is we do it under an environment that contains both of them together. So more often than not, we always want to combine the two. How can we combine the actual doing with the actual read? Because that's how we're going to see it actually work in a game, which is the most important thing. Yes, you can build skill, but if it doesn't translate to a game, what is the point? So again, we always want to combine the two. They're never separate in the game, so why are we going to separate them in practice? I get the point to some degree sometimes, but again, there's no real evidence that separating the two and then trying to combine them works. It just simply doesn't. Now, like I said, skills without underlying decisions is essentially useless. Now, they've done so many studies on high-level athletes, and they've obviously found that high-level athletes practice more. But what they also found is that high-level athletes practice specifically with higher levels of decision making. So it's not just the decision that underlies the skill, but the environment as well. So maybe I know how to get into a pull-up, one dribble pull-up going left based on how the defense is rating me, but what about the help side defense? What about the time and score? What about what my offensive player in the corner is doing? Is he cutting? Okay, maybe now I don't want to get into a shot, I want to pass. So there's so many different elements that go into being able to use skills properly, and oftentimes it comes down to decision making. We cannot learn decision making on air. As much as you want to say, okay, if a defender does this, you do this, right? These decisions are not conscious decisions. We don't have time to think in a game. They need to be subconscious, and you learn that by a lot of trial and error in small-sided games and reading the defense over and over and over again. Again, that does not work if you do it on air. Now, the last kind of point is tying all of this together, right? What makes small-sided games so beneficial? It's not just the, okay, there's great variability, so that skill is going to translate better. It's not just the fact that we're combining the perception action. It's not just the fact that it's way more specific. We're practicing under higher game qualities. It's the fact that, A, it's also more fun. We're also learning how to use these skills within a system. We're learning not just the skills, but we're learning how to play. We're learning how to move off the ball. We're learning how to cut. We're learning how to space without the ball, right? All of these things cannot be taught on air. The other thing is we're learning how to communicate with teammates. You can have all the skill in the world, right? You can be the best 1-on-0 player in the world. You can be the best, most skilled shooter in an empty gym. If you can't do it within a system, if you can't make reads, if you can't move without the ball, if you can't set screens, if you can't move off screens, it doesn't matter, right? If you can't communicate with your fucking teammates, again, it doesn't matter. So we can do all these things in isolation. It does not mean it's always going to translate, but again, we need to work on all these other things too. And getting to my first point, if something's more fun, kids are going to show up more. If kids show up more, they're going to get better. Simple as that, right? And the other thing is when we learn any skill with dopamine, which is what we get when we have fun, we're going to learn that skill better. It's going to stick a lot more better. When we're sitting in a line, yawning because we're trying to work on a skill with no defense and it's fucking boring, we're not going to learn as good, right? Simple as that. And we're not going to learn all of these other things. I hear coaches all the time, right? I see practices, coaches trying to teach kids how to backdoor. If a player does this, you backdoor. They get into a 5-on-5 setting, someone overcuts them, they don't backdoor. Why didn't you backdoor? You're not going to fucking learn how to do it on air, right? Because it's not realistic. It's not within the environment. There's no pressure. You're not actually reading anything. You're just being told what to read. And that's part of it. You know, you have to learn how to do these things. But again, we can learn these things way better within a 3-on-3, within a 2-on-2, within a 4-on-4, while learning everything else and while learning it in a way that's actually going to translate over into a game. Now, with all that said, hopefully that made sense to you. How can we actually use all of this information, right? Okay, I understand small-sided games are beneficial. How do we actually use them? The best way that I found is what we call play, drill, play. So you can still do some of your on-air training, but what we're going to do is we're going to start our practice with a small-sided game, some sort of drill that's fun, that's engaging, that's working on all of these components that we did, giving them context for what we're actually going to use on air. So if you want to do your on-air training 1-on-0, the most beneficial way that we can do this is by giving them context before and giving them context after. So again, you want to work on these backdoor cuts. Let's get into a drill that's forcing these kids into situations where they got to work on being able to read that backdoor and cut. They didn't learn it. Okay, now let's work on it on air. Now they have context. Okay, in this situation, that's when I should backdoor. If I backdoor, here are the options I can use. Okay, boom, we learned that on air. Now let's get back into playing. You can do this with any skill you want. Pull up jump shots, off the catch, pick and roll, handoffs, whatever it is, right? And this is just way more engaging way to run practices. Like I said earlier, if it's fun, we're going to get more engagement. When we get more engagement, we get more learning. It's just how it works, right? So if you still want to do that 1-on-0 stuff, which is beneficial from time to time, this is the way that I found to be the most effective way to combine the two Call it play, drill, play. The other thing is learning how to use these properly in season and off season. Again, this is not the only tool that we can use, and we shouldn't use this 7 days a week, 100% of our practices. Now, I do think that that can be beneficial to some degree depending on who you're working with. But say we have a player who is very skilled, right? Okay, we're going to use a little more small-sided games. Say we have a player who is very attuned to the decisions, when to cut. They know how to use all of these different decisions, but they don't really have the skill. Okay, that's when we might work on a little bit more of on-air stuff. But just learning, okay, if we're in season, if we're doing small-sided games, we're putting a little bit more risk at these players to get hurt. So maybe we back off of this a little bit, right? They're also getting plenty of 5-on-5 reps, so they're seeing a lot of game situations. Now on the flip side, say we're in the off season, they're not getting these games, they're not playing. We might want to do a little more small-sided games. So just kind of using a blend of all of these tools that you guys have as a trainer, but the main thing is just using these small-sided games much more often than you guys probably already do. But then just learning, again, how to blend the two kind of together. Now the other thing is, okay, say you see this, you want to try some small-sided games. Don't go from doing none to doing absolutely all small-sided games. As always with anything, it's not binary, right? It falls on a spectrum. So, okay, maybe next practice you implement a little. Start experimenting with it. Okay, this worked, I like this, now go a little bit more. So really it's just starting to shift more towards what we call a director of an ideal learning environment, as opposed to being a dictator telling players every single movement that they need to do. And that's really the art of training, is being more of a director of just creating that learning environment that's going to help athletes to the best of their ability. You don't need to tell athletes every single thing that they need to do. This is what you do in this situation. This is how you use this footwork. Allow them to learn. All you really have to do is set up the learning environment and just start to get them to lean towards the things that you want them to do without explicitly telling them all the fucking time. And then my last point really is just like I was kind of saying, training is an art. It's not learned overnight. Each day we get better at using these different tools, right? There's a lot of different tools we can use as a trainer. Small-sided games is one of them, and there's a lot that goes into it. But again, you're not going to learn it overnight. It's something that you're going to experiment with, and slowly over time you're going to get better at creating that ideal learning environment for the athlete that is in front of you to benefit them to the best of their ability. So that's kind of my presentation. Again, a lot of different things that we covered. Maybe you watch it again. Maybe you hit me up, ask me some more specific questions. This was my attempt at kind of explaining the scientific benefits to small-sided training and why it needs to be implemented much, much more, and why we need to kind of lean away from a lot of that one-on-0 stuff, working with no defense, and why it's not necessarily as beneficial as we think it is. Just because it's always been done this way doesn't mean that's the best way to actually help these athletes. If you care about helping these athletes, you'll shift more towards this, and you'll use this to the right degree. I'm not saying you need to only do this, but this is an extremely beneficial way to actually help athletes see actual results in games. Not just get better at practice, but get better in games. So hopefully this helped you guys. If it did, drop a comment. We'd really appreciate it. We're going to do some more kind of presentations like this just to keep kind of educating you guys. So appreciate it if you made it to the end. You are a real one. But yeah, with that said, see you guys soon.
Yeah, that's just way more fun. Way more fun.
Way more fun.
OD.